Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me for episode 14, part 1 of my series, The Strange and Unexplained Phenomena of the South Mountains of North Carolina. I'm your host, Kaiser Rebel, and I'm excited to get straight into tonight's episode. And it is titled, Do You Think That It Wanted My Baby Sister? We're going to be talking about a series of remarkable encounters as experienced by a family over in Burke County, North Carolina, on the other side of the South Mountains, the north side of the South Mountains. Not too awfully far from the town of Morganton, North Carolina. Philip, my witness, who relayed this information to me, was 12 years old at the time, at the beginning of these encounters. He had a little sister who we're going to call Sheila, age 8, and then it was his mother and his father, and they lived in an old farmhouse, well off the road, well off of a less traveled road, and actually you had to take a dirt road up, partly up the small mountain there to get to their home, to their farm. But we're going to go back to early November 1964. Philip and Sheila had to walk down the dirt road to the hard surface road on school days to catch the bus. And the bus, of course, let them off, and they had to walk back up to the house on the dirt road. There was a creek traversing kind of parallel with the road, the small bridge over it in two places. But one morning, Sheila and Phil left to walk down to the school bus. And they heard something walking in the woods off to their right. And Philip told me that he thought at the time that it was a bear or perhaps a panther, which is mountain talk for simply a mountain cat, a mountain lion. And he said they would stop walking and it would stop walking. And this happened several times as they made their way down to the hard surface road. As they reached the bridge over the small creek within sight of the road, they heard a sound, a loud growl, as he described it, followed by a higher pitched whistle. And they kept moving. And as they crossed the bridge, they heard another sound. And Phil told me, he said he felt like that it was actually coming from under the bridge. He said that he didn't look. He said they went to the road, and he told his little sister to watch for the bus, and he maintained a vigil, watching the bridge with his back turned toward the road. And he said that he felt oddly nervous and out of sorts. I asked him, did you feel a sense of dread or something like that? And he said, yes, I did. And then that afternoon, all was normal when the school bus let them off. And they crossed the small bridge. They heard that whistling sound once again. And he said he heard at the time what seemed to him to be a clacking sound. I pressed him on that. He said he wasn't sure if it was something hitting a tree or something hitting a rock, but that it was definitely out of the ordinary. And as they walked up the road, and there were woods for a short distance on both sides of this road, according to him, they heard something walking in the woods, but this time on each side of them. And his quote was, he felt like that they were stalking us. And I said, what do you mean by they? And he said, we'll get to that. But different from the morning, they also smelled an odd smell. He said he had never smelled it before. I asked him to describe it, and he couldn't give me great detail other than to say that it really stunk, and it was something he had never smelled before. And then they began to hear that whistling noise again from one side of the road. And Phil said that at that point, suddenly, he just felt horrified. No longer a sense of dread, no longer a feeling of dread, he said he was scared to death. And at the same time, his little sister, Sheila, began crying. And he said she was crying uncontrollably and loudly. Already holding her hand, he said, run, and they began running up the dirt road toward their home, yelling for their mother. Their father had a job in the town of Morganton, and he was not home. He says he does not remember if he heard the walking sounds or the whistling anymore once they started running, that it was kind of a blur to him. he only remembers the screaming and crying of his little sister. And their mom met them in the yard. And she said, get in the house. They had not, and keep in mind, they had not explained what was going on. But mother read the situation, I guess, and told them to get in the house. And she came right behind them. And they stayed in the house. Later that evening, when the father came home, Phil and Sheila, and Phil said it was mainly him, described to the father what had happened. But as he talked to his father and was describing the events, he said that little Sheila suddenly started crying again and managed to say, I saw a tall, hairy booger in the woods watching us. I saw it, and I saw its teeth. It was right behind the big old tree next to where my wagon is. And as Phil recalled it, that wagon was very close to the road, and he was sure he knew what tree she was talking about, which meant that was a distance of less than 15, 20 feet from them. The father told the kids to go to their respective rooms, and Phil said he did not go to his room, but rather he lingered outside the kitchen in defiance to his father, risking a whooping. But he heard his dad say, quote, me and Daddy, which was Phil's grandfather, the father's father, me and Daddy was sure that they were not around anymore. We'll have to really keep a watch out for them and watch them youngins. I hope they don't start going after my hogs like they did Poppy's. Phil never, to the day his father died, told him that he was eavesdropping and heard him say that. And Phil told me that he was haunted by those words, and just the words alone scared him to death, as you might can imagine. His dad never allowed him to walk alone to or from the bus stop, and actually, and you got to understand the economic times and the poverty in this area, he managed to get a loan and buy an old 1950s car, a Chevrolet car, for the mom to drive them to the bus stop and then to pick them up in the evenings on school days. The dad instructed them not to play behind the house or near the woods or the barn. And it was a short time later that the dad also somehow came up with the money to have some simple plumbing run into the house, because up until that point they actually had an outhouse. Though this was in the 60s, that might seem foreign to some people outside of the foothills and mountains of the Appalachians. That was still common in the 60s and even into the 70s. But the dad never spoke at all as to who they were that he mentioned when the son eavesdropped and heard him say what he said. And Phil asked his dad a few days later, he asked him, he said, what was following us? And Phil gave me this quote. He said, my daddy said, we best not speak about them, son. We live too close to their place. We're going to let them be. There was no more incidents for a while. As a matter of fact, all the way up into the summer of 1965. And in the summer, of course, school was out. Sheila and Phil were out playing in the yard. And as a big brother, as Phil recounted his story, he liked to aggravate his younger sister. I was an older sibling, and I lived to aggravate my brother and sisters. They'll say amen on that. But one day, and he said he wasn't sure what month it was, but it was very hot, maybe in July. Sheila had set her little doll down on the porch in a chair. And Phil said he took that opportunity to grab the doll. And he hid it in the tool shed, back kind of behind the house. She found the doll was missing and immediately looked at her brother Phil as the suspect. Phil said, we're going to play hide and seek. Your doll is hiding and you got to find it. I'll pick this up in part 2, and I am going to drop part 2 here in a minute. Thank you.